Most of us grew up loving dolphins. They're the smiling ambassadors of the sea, playful, intelligent, friendly. But here's the thing. That smile, it's fixed. It's not a reflection of their emotional state. And when we look past that permanent grin, we find something genuinely disturbing lurking beneath the surface. In the waters off the coast of Scotland, researchers documented something that reads less like a nature documentary and more like a crime report. Male bottlenose dolphins were forming alliances, gang-like coalitions that would systematically target other groups. They'd corral, isolate, and physically assault their victims. But here's where it gets really strange. This violence doesn't seem to serve any survival benefit. There's no territory at stake, no food to fight over, no mating rights being contested. And that's what makes it so fascinating. These dolphins weren't fighting for resources, they were fighting for the sake of fighting. But the behavior gets darker. Infanticide. Male dolphins have been observed killing calves not for food, but seemingly as a strategy to bring the mother back into estrus. They're essentially committing murder to create more mating opportunities. And when you look at their behavior through a psychological lens, something disturbing starts to emerge. Because when we start applying human psychological frameworks, specifically the clinical definition of psychopathy, to animal behavior, we find ourselves staring into something that looks an awful lot like darkness. A pattern of behavior that isn't just survival of the fittest. It's something else entirely. And that answer, unsettling as it might be, is what we're going to explore today. Because whether it's a dolphin gang in the waters of Scotland, a dog that just doesn't seem to care about your feelings, or a chimpanzee who treats his peers like pawns in a game, the patterns are eerily familiar. Let's get into it. Because to understand whether animals can be psychopaths, we first need to understand what psychopathy actually means in humans. And I promise you the definition might surprise you. When most people hear the word psychopath, they think of serial killers and movie villains. But clinically speaking, psychopathy isn't about being evil. It's a measurable personality construct, a cluster of traits that exist on a spectrum in the general population. And those traits include things like shallow emotional experience, a lack of empathy, grandiose sense of self-worth, manipulative social strategies, impulsivity, and most importantly, a failure to learn from punishment or social consequences. It's not a single trait, it's a cluster. And clinicians have spent decades developing tools like the Hare Psychopathy Checklist to measure these traits in humans. But here's the question that scientists started asking about 30 years ago. If these traits aren't uniquely human, could they be part of a broader biological pattern that extends across species? And if so, what would that tell us about the nature of personality and about ourselves? The psychopathic individual, in human terms, isn't necessarily violent. In fact, most aren't. But they share this fundamental characteristic. Their emotional experience is shallow. They can mimic empathy, but they don't feel it. They can perform social bonding, but they don't form genuine attachments. And most importantly, they view other people not as ends in themselves, but as tools to be used. So when researchers started looking at animals through this lens, they weren't looking for evil. They were looking for a measurable pattern of behavior involving impulsivity, callousness, and a failure to learn from social consequences. And what they found was genuinely striking. Because the question isn't whether animals can be evil. The question is whether they can exhibit a consistent, measurable pattern of behavior that parallels human psychopathy. And the answer, it turns out, is yes. Yes, they can. But to do this properly, scientists needed to adapt human personality research for non-human subjects. They needed to develop species-specific frameworks that could measure the same underlying traits. And 3 studies in particular stand out as genuinely fascinating. The work on chimpanzees, the surprisingly robust findings on dogs, And perhaps most unsettling of all, the documented patterns in dolphins. We're going to look at all three. But first, let's talk about the methods. Because how do you even measure something like psychopathy in a species that can't fill out a questionnaire? The approach was clever. Researchers took personality assessment frameworks, the kind used to measure human psychopathy, and adapted them for animals. They asked zookeepers, handlers, and caretakers to rate the animals they knew best on specific behavioral criteria. And the real question is, what did those studies actually find? Did animals show anything resembling human psychopathy? And if so, what does that mean for our understanding of personality itself? Let's start with the most surprising subject, man's best friend. Because if you've ever owned a dog, you've probably wondered at some point, especially during that moment when they've eaten your shoes and shown zero remorse, whether your dog might secretly be a psychopath. And researchers at the University of Helsinki actually studied this. They developed something called the Canine Psychopathy Framework, adapting human personality research for domestic dogs. And the results were genuinely fascinating because dogs, like humans, show measurable variation on a spectrum. Now let me be clear about something upfront. When researchers talk about psychopathy in dogs, they're not saying your golden retriever is a furry serial killer. That's not what this is. What they're measuring is a consistent pattern of behavior that maps onto the same dimensions we see in human personality. The framework measured three key dimensions: impulsivity, callous-unemotional tendencies, and what researchers called fearfulness. But the most interesting findings came from looking at how these traits manifested in social behavior. And the question was simple: could we measure something analogous to psychopathy in a species that has been domesticated for tens of thousands of years? And if so, what would those traits look like in a dog? Turns out, the answer was yes. Dogs that scored higher on the impulsivity dimension were more likely to exhibit problem behaviors: jumping, barking, destructive chewing. But it wasn't just about being poorly trained. It was about a consistent pattern of behavior that looked remarkably similar to human impulsivity. But the most striking findings came from the callous-unemotional dimension. Dogs that scored higher on this measure showed something that looks an awful lot like the callousness we see in human psychopathy: a reduced responsiveness to social reinforcement. Because in dogs, these callous-unemotional traits were linked to increased aggression. Not just normal dog aggression, but something that looked more instrumental, more calculated. It wasn't about fear or resource guarding. It was about using aggression as a tool to achieve goals. And here's the thing that the clickbait headlines won't tell you: most animals that score high on these measures aren't evil. They're not plotting against you. They're not furry serial killers hiding in plain sight. They're just different. But let's move on from dogs. Because as fascinating as the canine research is, it pales in comparison to what scientists found when they studied our closest living relatives, chimpanzees. And that's where we start to see patterns that are truly hard to ignore. Researchers at institutions like the University of St. Andrews adapted human psychopathy assessments for chimpanzees in sanctuary populations. And what they found was remarkable. Chimpanzees show a similar three-dimensional pattern of traits, mapping onto the same framework used for humans. But they didn't just withdraw from social interactions, they exploited them. These chimpanzees would take food from others without sharing in return. They'd interrupt grooming sessions for their own benefit. They'd use intimidation to get what they wanted, without any apparent concern for the social consequences. But the most striking finding was this: chimpanzees that scored high on these psychopathy-like measures showed reduced rates of reconciliation behavior. And reconciliation is a core, universal feature of chimpanzee social life. This behavior serves a crucial function: it repairs social bonds. It reduces tension. It allows the group to function smoothly again. And most importantly, it's something that virtually every chimpanzee does. Virtually every chimpanzee, that is, except for the ones that score high on these psychopathy-like measures. Now, the researchers were careful not to call this psychopathy. They called it something more neutral, callous-unemotional traits. But when you look at the behavioral pattern, the parallels with human psychopathy are striking. The same dimensions, the same social consequences, the same apparent lack of remorse. This is a compelling piece of evidence because it suggests that the social mechanisms that normally correct behavior in chimpanzee groups, the mechanisms that maintain cooperation and cohesion, simply don't work on these individuals. And here's where the comparison with human psychopathy becomes truly persuasive. Because human psychopaths show the same pattern, they don't respond to social consequences. They don't learn from punishment. They don't adjust their behavior based on the emotional responses of others. And yet, when you look at dolphin social behavior, you see the same patterns emerging. Gang-like coalitions, instrumental aggression, infanticide, and most importantly, a failure to learn from social consequences. So here's what we've learned so far. Dogs show measurable variation on dimensions that parallel human psychopathy. Chimpanzees show a more pronounced pattern: reduced reconciliation, increased manipulation, failure to respond to social consequences. And dolphins show something that looks even darker: coalitional violence, infanticide, and behavior that serves no apparent survival benefit. If you found this exploration as fascinating as I did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We're just getting started. Drop a comment below. Have you ever seen dark behavior in an animal? I'd love to hear your stories. Turn on notifications so you don't miss part 2. I'll see you in the next one.